Hey everybody, welcome to another tutorial with the wonderful Elementor page builder in WordPress, and today we're going to be focusing on one particular CSS hack, which is to do with the wonderfully new CSS Grid. It's finally out from behind the flag and it's supported by all major browsers, and the great thing about CSS Grid, it does things that other grids just don't do. We can specify rows and columns, size and position objects accordingly on them. It gives us great control, but today we're just going to focus on a very simple part of CSS Grid. If you want more information, I suggest you go on to CSS Tricks or check out Rachel Andrew and a particularly wonderful Grid by Example website. But today we're just going to use the standard build, and what we're going to do is we're going to use the Elementor post widget to show off how this can work. And what we can see here is we now have the post widget displaying grid items in a more funky layout than you would have with your normal standard columns or masonry effects. So let's jump in straight at the back end. I'd advise you go grab yourself a cup of tea before you continue, because this is fairly code heavy and slightly longer than the normal tutorials I like to do. So here we go. We've got a standard widget of 4 columns wide showing our posts, and we're going to go into the Elementor style and we're going to apply it with a class. Now I've named it DB Portfolio Grid as usual. As a precursor of DB, which is my initial, so as I can make sure that this piece of code is fairly explicit and therefore it won't clash with any other styles. So now we have that in place, we're going to look at the custom CSS and we're going to start with our first line of code, which is to specify that that grid element and the containers within it are going to be a grid. So we do that with a very simple piece of code, which is this. So we have our portfolio grid and the 2 containers that are nested within inside that, and we displayed grid, and the first thing we see is it breaks the existing flex box and turns it into a single column. So let's now start to build our grid, and the way we do that is by specifying the template columns and rows, and that's 2 very simple functions that we're going to paste in next. And all we've got here is we've basically said let's create 15 columns that are 6% wide. That's what the repeat statement does. It says basically repeat the 6% 15 times. And we're going to end up with these rows where we're going to introduce a new fraction unit, which is specified by the height of the biggest units in any particular row. So you take wherever the largest item in the row is and you say that's going to occupy 1 fraction in that particular instance. And the auto is basically say just create me the rows as I need them. I don't want to tell you how many rows there needs to be, but I could specify a fixed amount, but we're going to leave it as auto. So that's our first thing, and what we can see now is we have nothing whatsoever because we need to now specify the sizing and the positioning of the objects. So let's now delve in a little bit deeper, and what we're going to do is we're going to place in our next line of code, and all this does is actually focus down on the contents of that container by specifying this greater than asterisk. It says everything within the container, I want you to set the width to 100% and make it important. Likewise, the grid was set to important so as it overrides what Elementor tells it to do. And as we can see, we've got 15 columns across, and as we scroll down we'll find that there's one very, very long column that specifies the height of the row, and then there's the other 2 rows automatically created, and again that row's been set to the height of the longest column. So that's fairly simple. Doesn't look great, but it proves that it's working. So let's now start placing items on the grid, and what happens as the grid picks up items, it just automatically places them in the next available space. So we can be very specific about where we want to place items, but at the same time we can use the auto function again, which says your starting position will be where you came in the list. And what we've done now is we've said, okay, let's start all of our columns where they became, and all of our items that are going to span 2 of the 15 columns that were placed above. And likewise the same with a row. Now the row is not too specific because actually it doesn't matter for this type of content. We could actually set that down to 1 and we won't have any noticeable difference. Likewise, we could also fix position items. So we could say we want them all starting in column 1 and they will end up creating a single column item. We also can say let's start them all in row 1, and effectively every single item is now placed on top of each other, which is pretty damn awesome because it means you can actually overlap items on a grid. But we're not going to go into that detail today, so we're going to put back the auto items in place, and there we have our grid set up. And just to prove, we can span and increase our column widths. So let's leave the code at that particular point, and now let's specify an item on the grid and where we want it to be placed and what size we want it to be. So what's the way we do this? Because all the items have been automatically placed by Elementor, let's target by the nth child pseudo property. And the way this works is we've got our grid and we've got our container, and within that container there's a number of articles, and we want to talk to the nth child number 9. So just to prove this, what we're going to do now is to slap in a similar piece of code where we specified our columns and rows, and when we place that in place and we go and have a look at that item on the grid, we can see it's now wider. So again, just to prove it, we can change around the width, and what we find at the moment is it actually spans more than one column. So again, that's where this number of rows is kicking in. So what happens here, it forces a space in place, and the item that would come after this just jumps to the next available space. So that's pretty damn handy. So again, for the tutorial, we could go through and specify every single child and every single position. Likewise, if they had specific classes on each item, and we're not going to go and delve into the Elementor code to find them, we could go through and say, nth child number 1, well, I want you here and this size, and so on and so forth, until we create a rather wonderful fixed grid of our own design. So that's some quite amazing stuff. But what we're going to do is we're going to take advantage of the wonders of WordPress that actually does these amazing things without us knowing about it. So for example, every time you create a post and you give it a category, guess what? That class gets attached to that particular post page, it gets attached to the item in the blog roll, and particularly into this portfolio post widget. So what we can see here is we can now target anything that's got the category hyphen followed by our category name. So all we need to use is this bit of code as standard followed by any category name, which using the Elementor widget anyway, we can see them because here they are. So let's say we want to style the gallery. We could actually do this anywhere, not inside a grid, but anywhere within our code. So just on a normal standard page that's got a post widget on it, let's say we want all of our backgrounds to be red for the gallery. And if we were to change that name to say our help category, we can then move it. So that's a little snippet on how to style things without well, to style post items, which is absolutely brilliant. So let's just remove that out of the code so you can see how that works. You can have that one for free. And what we're going to do now is we're going to specify how would we like these to be placed out on our grid. So again, we're going to say we want to have these all automatically placed, and we want it to span 6 columns, and we want it to span 4 rows. So now we see some bigger objects within our gallery placed out. So that's our first line. Now we can go through and do the rest of these, and I've already got the code saved where we've identified the other 3 categories we have, and anything that doesn't have a category will fall back to this standard line up here. So now when we have a look, we've actually got our code all in place, and we have all different size post items. Now, one really cool thing is the way that grid can work in flowing items. We can tell it to flow in columns or in rows, but we can also do a particular auto flow mechanism, which is only here to do with CSS Grid, and that is called auto flow dense. And what that does is it says, hey, I've got some white space, so let's just take that out a minute. And what we can see is we've got this white space up here because this item is too big to fit in it. And as we move down the screen, we find other gaps appearing. The auto flow dense, what that effectively does is says, hey, if there's an item that I can fit into that space further down the stack, let's do that. So by literally adding that dense code, we now reshuffle the items. Now you've got to be mindful of the fact that this is reorganizing it on the screen, not the order of the DOM file. So just consider things such as screen readers and accessibility tools that would be affected by this. But for this particular instance of just displaying posts in any random order, it works and it's a great thing. So let's go forward and have a look at how that looks. So if we save it, one thing we can see here though is we're probably a little bit off center. Our content isn't sitting central in the box. So let's take advantage of the other grid system of Flex Grid. Now handily, this particular post container here already actually has a flex box in it. So we don't actually have to specify as a flex, but we can take advantage of that and use the flex properties of justify center. Now if it didn't have that property already attached, then we'd have to display this as a flex. Okay, so that's fairly simple. Now this goes to show the great part about it is we've got a CSS grid inside a flex grid, and we could have a flex grid inside a CSS grid, and we could carry on nesting grids all day long, and we've got the ability of both. We've got the flexibility of flex, the justification and position of flex, and we've also got this brilliant mechanism of laying our own templates for CSS Grid to move items around the place. So it looks like quite a detailed bit of code, but here we go, we've got our setup already, and then we can jump to the front page. So when we hit the front page, we can now see we've got our nice centered grid and our random layout. Now if we had set in the back end and we may already have in our content query setting, what we will find is there's a list here for doing random orders. So let's quickly just view that page again, and we'll see that the layout now changes. So every time you visit the page, you've got a random layout of your items. So that's pretty cool. You can set it to title, or you can put some other queries in if you want to keep it in a specific way. But look, we end up with these wonderfully randomized post widget grids. So what happens when we go responsive? Now, of course, what's going to happen here is they're all going to squish into a big old flat line. Not so good, you may think. But let's take advantage of the code that already exists within Elementor. When we hit mobile phones, we generally end up with a single column, and when we're on our narrower tablet screens that can't deal with the same size as a desktop, and considering most of the iPads now are big enough that they can actually handle desktop views, we only really have to worry about what happens when it's not on a desktop screen. So in order to be able to fix that issue, let's just quickly jump back to our code. And what we're going to do is we're going to wrap our entire code with a media query. So this is fairly simple, just to say that whenever the width is a minimum of 1024 pixels, apply this code. And then what happens when you're not in that particular state, you find out, and we're just going to use the preview here, that it just defaults to the Elementor standards. Now we can write a couple of more media queries to change this, and the only thing we'd have to really change in this instance is how we'd specify our grid layout within the media query. And there may be a couple of these items that we want to change to say, I'd sooner them occupy different sizes of columns or rows. So worst case, you'd have to copy this piece of code over again and designate probably some changes to do with this, and maybe sneak down and pick off a few of them. But I'm not going to bore you with that, because this is just literally to give you a showcase of how CSS Grid can work with the Elementor Page Builder, and for us to create these rather amazing sort of randomized, flexible, crazy layout grids using our post widget. Of course, we can take it a step further, but that's for another tutorial. So hopefully this inspired you, hopefully you've learned something, and that's all from me. Until next time.